Hello, everyone. It is a pleasure to welcome you today to our International Perspectives on Parenting and Child Development Conference. I am really happy to be here, and I'm really especially to have all of our international guests here. I am going to just give you a very, very brief orientation to the Parenting Across Cultures project, which is what brought us all here today. The speakers today, well, some of them will be talking about work from the Parenting Across Cultures project. Some will be talking about other work going on in their respective countries. So you'll hear a smattering of findings. Our study launched in 2008 when we recruited a sample of 8-year-olds and their mothers and fathers in 9 countries. So the red countries here on the map are those that are still participating to this day. So we have China and Colombia and Italy, Jordan, Kenya, and Thailand and the Philippines, Sweden, and the United States. And we've been annually interviewing the children and their mothers and fathers in all of these countries. The kids are no longer kids; they're 22 years old on average now. So over time, our research questions have evolved, and we would imagine developmentally. So when we first started the project, we were asking a lot of questions about parental discipline and things that were going on with 8-year-olds, sort of in middle childhood. Now that the kids are 22 years old, our next 5 years of research questions focus a lot on parent-young adult relationships, on major milestones in early adulthood, and timing of major milestones in early adulthood changes, or it's different in different cultural contexts. Over the last years since the pandemic, instead of collecting data once a year, we've been collecting data 4 times a year, which is also letting us now turn to some longitudinal analyses tracking people's anxiety and depression and substance use and things like this, kind of in sync with some changes that were going on with COVID restrictions or other COVID-related things in these different countries. And we'll continue now in the next 5 years to look at longitudinal outcomes that are linked not only to what was going on in childhood and adolescence for these kids, but things that were going on during the pandemic as well. So this international team is truly what's a treasure about the Parenting Across Cultures project. So the way that we've done this work is that we partner with folks in this room, as well as some others who are not in this room, at universities in all 9 of the participating countries. Over time, our group has traveled the world together. So we've met now in all of the participating countries, at universities in those countries. And it's a treat because we've also been able to meet with some of the participating families in the different countries. And thanks to Elid and Teresa, we even met with a couple of the US participating families this week here. And that's really nice because mostly we've done quantitative data collection. And so typically what we see when we're running analyses is numbers in SPSS files. But when we've gone to the different countries, what's been really important sometimes is really being able to meet the families and in some cases even gone into homes of families. And that's given us a richer perspective, I think, on parenting and child development in these different countries. So the way that today specifically will be structured, we're going to have a pretty, with the exception of a break at 10:05, we'll kind of go continuously from one speaker to another. And we're going to stick closely to a 15-minute limit per speaker. So, and the speakers know that. So I'll, kind of. There are printed programs available out where the breakfast was. But certainly, between now and our scheduled break at 10:05, feel free to come and go as you need to take care of other things. We know that folks will be doing that. And we, depending on how the timing goes with the individual speakers, if they haven't yet used their full 15 minutes on the formal talk, we'll take questions up to 15 minutes. Otherwise, we have a long period at the end of today where we'll have lots of time for questions and discussion. So, I think that if you do have questions but have to leave before the end of that period, you can feel free to contact me, Jennifer Lansford, so lansford@duke.edu, and I'm happy to connect you with individual speakers as well. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, who's Sangat. He is led this the Thailand site for many years, and we've now expanded the Thailand team to include other folks who will speak later today. Somdat founded the Peace Foundation in Thailand and is now running a lot of work on including parenting interventions through the Peace Foundation, and we will be speaking about some of that work with you. Somdat.
Got my timer here. Okay. Sure. Is it on? Okay. Right. Good morning, everyone. I'm Sombat from Thailand, formerly Chiang Mai University, but I have retired some years ago and have been involved in PACT project since the beginning. And during the past 5 years or so, I became involved in another project, which is also related to the issue, which is parenting, and it's called Parenting for Lifelong Health. And this program, parent training, was founded in South Africa over a decade ago, and now it's operating in over 20 countries around the world. And fortunately, Thailand has been included in this. So I will tell you about what we have been doing on this. And if I could have my slides. Oh, there. Okay, thank you. All right. So I'll tell you about the challenges that we have to face, especially with the COVID and other things. We got a support from UNICEF Thailand and the Ministry of Public Health, and that's a very important player because we want to integrate this into the public health service system so that it's sustainable. Otherwise, after a few years, it will fade away. And University of Oxford, there are a number of experts there who a lot of us here are colleagues familiar with. And we receive funding from the World Childhood Foundation, which is in Sweden, and Lego Foundation. So going back, from 2018, we did the first stage, the formative evaluation and program adaptation. And then with good result, we move on to the stage 2, pilot feasibility, and with 60 families, in 2019. And then the last one, the RCT, with 120 families, with 60 in control group, receiving public health services as usual. And then the other group, the experimental group, they went through the program. It's 8 week of a weekly 2.5 hours meeting with a small group of parents, 15 parents. And this is what it looks like. And we operate in what we call health promotion hospitals. And in Thailand, we divide the areas into provinces. And within the province, there are districts. And then within each district, there are several sub-districts. And within the sub-districts, there are villages, so maybe 10, 12 villages. And the hospital is in the sub-district. And it's called Health Promotion Hospital, but they do a lot of maternal care things and primary care, and not really promoting health in like the official sense, but they're still stuck in the old medical model. So providing medical services, but a lot of mother-child activities like vaccination and so on. So we recruited what we call village health volunteers, which are people in the community to help us find the families. And then, we recruit those families into the program. And we train public health workers. Some of them are social workers, some of them are nurses to become facilitators. So this is what the training program session looks like. And that's, the facilitator there, here, and the parents. Okay, and pilot results are very positive, and that's encourage us to move to the next one. The RCT, and this is the characteristics of families, and you can see that a lot of them are grandparents, about half, and the participants are mostly female. So now we are engaging another project called male engagement to improve this, and it's been difficult. And they are with a low education and low income, unemployed, low skill work, and so on. Again, we get very good results, as you can see, and no harmful effects. And some are not significant, but trending towards the positive direction. That's very encouraging. So after moving, like pointing somewhere.
No. Oh, I'm sorry, probably.
Just moving those in like
That's
Not working. Okay. So now we are in this stage, scaling up. So we want to engage the nursing. Anyway, but the next 5 years we will get funding from LEGO Foundation and World Childhood Foundation to scale up. But quickly, I will tell you about the challenges that we have. I think it's in the last slide. You can read this later or here. There. So people who are very supportive of us are mostly senior. And by the time you get started, they start to retire. So new people coming in and it's a problem. And then there are different ministries and offices, and they don't really get along. And the Thai government officials, but bureaucracy, right? So that's a big problem. And the people we train to be facilitators also have very heavy workload, and they are not always, available there to help. So that's it's been a struggle. But we have a lot of other things to do, as you can see, and connecting to other countries in this network called Global Parenting Initiative. And if you are interested, we can find out information about it and maybe talk to me after. So thank you very much.
There's plenty. If folks have questions for Sambat, you're welcome to ask them now. Yeah, Drew.
Well, that's a good question. It was Sambat. This is just such an incredible initiative, and especially I was struck by the population that you were able to recruit to participate in this program. And you said that you use village health volunteers. I was wondering, how did they engage the folks that you were able to bring into the program, how did they reach people that might not otherwise have been reached by this program?
Yeah. Village health volunteers are local folks, so they know everyone, and it's a rural area, so they know, the families and those who are also at risk, and mostly, harsh parenting and abuse and neglect. So they are able to help us in recruiting the families, but also we have to assess them. We have assessment tools to make sure that they fit the criteria.
Yeah.
Wow, so it's a lot of them, the village health volunteers around the country.
Could you say more about your outreach to male caregivers, how you're approaching that differently, or being changed? Has that started yet?
We are starting and struggling, like especially recruiting participants for interview and focus group. It is very hard, especially, and we have a subgroup, teenage parents, teenage fathers, and it's impossible to get them. And the typical pattern of male non-engagement in Thailand is, it's like they're not really interested in child care. They say, no, we do other more important things, like world issues, and let the wife take care of the kids, that kind of attitude. So.
Any other questions for Conf?
Thank you for sharing some of this with us. I was curious to know what the relationship is between the researchers or people doing the intervention and the people in the community. I'm wondering if there's a general trust or mistrust or skepticism around this work.
To a certain degree, and we have to work on that, and by networking and really embedding ourselves in the community. We meet them often, we try to develop a positive relationship with them, and with the help of the local workers there, so it's easier to gain trust from them. I can.
Hello, Samba. Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation and work. I'm wondering what part of the intervention do you think would be transferable, exportable to other cultures, and what portion is very specific to your local culture?
That's a very important question and hard to answer. I think that it's like two levels. One is like the universal elements, like, we have to give kids attention, right? And interact with them. That's like in every culture. But then at the cultural level, well, again, if you talk about Asia, we are very similar in many ways, so it's not so hard to export the practice into other Asian cultures. With maybe Western culture more different and more difficult. Like the most obvious one would be the role of men. Like, we are struggling with a lot of men are just not interested, and there is a strong belief, like it's the women's work to take care of the children, not men. We have to go out to work and earn money to support the family, and maybe meeting out the discipline, mostly, corporal punishment. That's the father's role, and they take on the role of disciplinarian and being tough and all that macho attitude, not very affectionate.
Strikes me that the Parenting Across Cultures research team, representing so many different cultures around the world, has a terrific opportunity to test the exportability or the transferability or the local adaptation.
Yes, there's the issue of local language as well, and some different concepts that we have to make sure that we understand them and adjust for what we have to tell them to fit that, so that it doesn't feel foreign to them.
Thank you very much, Sangha. I will next call up Drew Rothenberg, who is right here at Duke and is going to talk about intergenerational transmission of maladaptive parenting. Drew.
I have a tough act to follow because Sangha was on time and had an amazing presentation, so.
You're welcome.
Oh my goodness. I am so honored to be here with you all today. And like Jen was saying, I'm going to be talking about the intergenerational transmission of maladaptive parenting and its impact on child mental health using the Parenting Across Cultures data set, and thinking about how it happens and how we can stop it. And by happenstance, actually it probably wasn't by happenstance. Very smart people sequenced the presentations this way, I'm sure. But it really, a lot of what I'll be talking about integrates very well with what Sambat was presenting earlier. So I'm excited to get started and talk with you all about this. So the first point that I kind of wanted to bring up is thinking about this construct, maladaptive parenting, as a problem facing families worldwide. And the way that I define maladaptive parenting based on the theoretical framework I'll introduce later is this constellation of parenting behaviors: physical and verbal coldness or lack of affection, hostility and aggression, indifference and neglect, or just completely undifferentiated rejection towards their children. That's kind of what I think of when you hear maladaptive parenting or rejecting parenting in this presentation. That's the constellation of parenting behaviors I'm talking about. And there are several groups that have looked at the cost of these behaviors worldwide, and it amounts to $3.6 trillion in adverse child and family outcomes. That's at least 2% of gross domestic product in every world region lost, and the equivalent of the fifth largest economy in the world of health detriment that emerges from maladaptive parenting. And just try to provide some visuals here of what that might look like, what $1 billion or $1 trillion looks like compared to a person. And that total is bigger than the economies of Australia, Spain, and Mexico combined. So we know that maladaptive parenting has enormous effects worldwide. Unfortunately, we also know from longitudinal studies in high-income Western nations that maladaptive parenting has intergenerational effects, at least for some families. And so the idea here, I'll introduce some terminology. When I say intergenerational effects of maladaptive parenting, I'm talking about parenting that emerges in generation 1 or G1 parents who I'm in my 30s. So my parents had me in 1990. So when they were parenting in the 1990s, they were generation 1. And now I'm in my 30s, I'm generation 2 as a parent. So I'm looking at how their parenting affects my parenting, G2, with my generation 3 children who are growing up right now. So you see G1 and G2, G3, that's what that means. But people have looked intergenerationally at how those G1 parents, their behaviors affect generation 2 and generation 3 children. And in both cases, we see more severe externalizing and internalizing behavior, so depression, aggression, anxiety, less marital satisfaction and greater marital stress when G2s grow up, and less warm and more cold parenting. And then in generation 3 children, which is kind of remarkable because they've never actually had they've never directly been parented by generation 1. This is generation 1 parenting 20 years before they were born. Actually predicts more severe externalizing and internalizing and more severe lifetime drinking behaviors in those G3 children, even though they've never actually experienced that G1 parenting. And that even holds after accounting for a whole bunch of demographic covariates. So it seems like this is a phenomenon that emerges over and over again. So we know that maladaptive parenting is an enormous problem and that it can demonstrate transmission across generations, but there's still some unanswered questions that I'm going to talk with you all about today. One, this is our basic model, is this idea. So we know generation 1 maladaptive parenting predicts generation 2 maladaptive parenting, which then predicts generation 3 poor mental health. But what we don't know is this intergenerational pathway the same across cultures around the world? Because most of the studies that have looked at this are based in the United States or maybe it's somewhere in Europe. So we want to answer that question. It might be the case that this is an intergenerational pathway around the world, because interpersonal acceptance and rejection theory, which is theoretical framework established by Ron Rohner that a lot of people use around the world, posits that all humans have this enduring universal emotional need for positive responses from parents in childhood. So this theoretical framework, I-part theory, would predict that there would be this intergenerational transmission around the world. There's also this question of cultural normativeness. What if in some cultures, some of these maladaptive parenting behaviors are just more typical than in other cultures? Is that transmission pathway stronger in those cultures because people are able to observe those parenting behaviors more readily and therefore make it easier for them to incorporate them into their parenting practices? That's something we don't quite know yet. The second question is whether there are protective factors that can stop this transmission across cultures. And it just so happens one of the potential protective factors that we'll look at today is our parenting programs, very similar to the Parenting for Lifelong Health program that Sambat has run in Thailand, as well as income supplements. If you're able to provide families with a greater income or economic benefits in some way, does that break this intergenerational cycle because parents sort of have the economic resources needed to reduce their parenting stress and maybe lower the likelihood that they engage in the rejecting behaviors that their parents did? And finally, there's a third question that's more exploratory, that we actually talked about a little bit in the last presentation, is do these pathways and protective factors differ for G2 mothers versus fathers? The literature is pretty equivocal here. There's not a lot of it, and it's kind of unclear. So that'll be a much more exploratory examination in my presentation today. Just make sure I'm still on track. All right. So let's get going to answer some of these questions. I will briefly introduce the Parenting Across Cultures project because Jen has already done such a fabulous job introducing it. But in our study, what I've looked at are 1,338 G2 parent and G3 child families for 12 cultural groups in 9 countries, with G3 children followed from ages 8 to 17. So that's the sample that I'm working from, that I'm sure you'll hear more about today. And there's also a litany of measures that I've looked at to try to see whether this intergenerational process occurs. So just to give you a brief overview of those measures, there's G1 parent rejection behaviors, all of those maladaptive constellation of behaviors I talked about earlier. Those were retrospectively reported on by G2s. So G2s who are now parenting their G3s are thinking back to their childhood and saying, when I was 7 to 12, when I was around the age that I'm parenting my G3 child, how did my parents parent? And so that's the measure that captures G1 parent rejection. G2 mother and father rejection behaviors were also measured by the same parental acceptance and rejection questionnaire, but this time G2s were reporting on their own parenting to their G3 children. G3 child externalizing and internalizing symptoms were reported on with the child behavior checklist to examine child mental health. And then for each of these questions, there were specific other measures that were created. To answer this question of, what if there are different levels of normativeness, of frequency of parenting behaviors in a culture, does that make a difference in this transmission process? We actually we created cultural normativeness groups where we calculated the whole grand mean of parent rejection across the entire sample, and then saw whether specific cultures were significantly below that mean, in which case they were in a below average parent rejection group. They were less likely to display on a cultural level these parent rejecting behaviors. And then we also put cultures in average and above average cultural groups. To analyze our 2 protective factors, we had one item, which we'll talk about as a limitation, that asked mothers and fathers if they had ever participated in any parenting programs. So it's not this really richly measured, well-controlled randomized control trial like what Sambat ran. It's a much more naturalistic single item that we looked at here for this protective factor. And then for income changes, we also looked at whether mothers and fathers reported whether their income decreased, greater than 5%, stayed the same or decreased over the last 5 years. And then we examined pathways in mothers and fathers separately using a technique called structural equation modeling. So what did we find? What we found was a couple of different things based on each of the different questions I posed earlier. So first, is this intergenerational pathway to parent rejection the same across cultures around the world? We found that it is. The intergenerational pathway of parent rejection emerges regardless of whether G2 fathers or mothers were examined and regardless of the level of cultural normatives and parent rejection behaviors. So you can see that same path that I drew earlier, you can often, all of these numbers are bold, which indicates that it's significant in every group. So no matter whether you're in a below average, or above average parent rejecting culture, and no matter whether you're a father or mother, or whatever mental G3 mental health symptom you're looking at, you see this pattern of higher G1 parent rejecting behaviors predicting higher G2 parent rejecting behaviors predicting worse child mental health outcomes. However, there is a caveat. The intergenerational transmission of parent rejection seems even stronger in cultures where parent rejection behaviors are more normative. So you can see here at the bottom of the screen, each of these numbers is bigger for the most part than in the above average cultures, in the cultures where parent rejection is more frequent than other cultural settings. So we see this intergenerational transmission process, but it's strongest in cultures that are experiencing that have normatively high levels of parent rejection. Question 2 is, are parenting programs a protective factor that can stop this transmission across cultures? And what we found in our sample, which really dovetails with some of that's most recent work thinking about father engagement and how to engage father in parenting programs, is that yes, it is a protective factor, but especially for fathers from cultures with high normative levels of parent rejection. So that's the real key here, is if you're a father from a culture where it's much more common to see these parent rejecting behaviors, you're not likely to have this intergenerational process happen if you participate in the parenting program. But if you don't, that intergenerational transmission of maladaptive parenting still persists. So there's something about participation in that parenting program potentially for fathers in those high rejection cultures that makes a difference. And you can see the same effect here with the externalizing behavior. The second part 2 of question 2 was whether income changes were a protective factor that can stop this transmission across cultures. And this was kind of the opposite finding. So for here we found, yes, it does, but for the most part, only in G2 mothers and not in G2 fathers in our sample. So for this sample, it seemed like in families that gain greater than 5% of their yearly income over the past year, this intergenerational process was stymied. But not in other types of families, except with one exception, which was this above average rejecting culture, the culture of high cultural normativeness with internalizing behaviors. But for the most part, we saw this protective effect of increases in family income from mothers. So question 3, kind of bringing these two things together, was does this protective pathway differ across G2 mothers and G2 fathers? And it seems like the pathway itself doesn't. It seems like no matter who you ask, there's this intergenerational pathway that where G1 parenting predicts G2 maladaptive parenting predicts G3 child mental health. But the protective factors, at least in this sample, kind of did differ a little bit. So for G2 fathers in high rejecting cultures, high normative rejecting cultures, parenting programs appear to make some sort of difference. They break this intergenerational cycle. Whereas income increases appear to break this intergenerational cycle in G2 mothers from most types of cultures, from most types of normativeness cultures, different levels of normativeness and rejection. So what does it all mean? Let me make sure I have enough time to explain what it all means. If not, I can go through. Okay, great. We're doing right on time. The first thing is that this universal intergenerational parent rejection pathway does seem to be something, at least in our sample, that is demonstrated across cultures. But this intergenerational pathway is even stronger in cultures with higher normative levels of parent rejection. So some of the potential solutions to that issue, if these data are able to be replicated, are countrywide public health campaigns or legislation that prevent parent rejection behaviors. And in fact, another member of our team, Leanne, actually wrote about this and documented these effects of countrywide ban in Kenya on corporal punishment and how it actually changed parenting behaviors and shifted parenting behaviors to being more adaptive. So these types of legislation and public health campaigns do appear to make a difference in at least some countries. The second, I promise I didn't talk with Sabat beforehand about this. But the other question is, or what parenting programs might be able to break this intergenerational pathway in fathers? And the Parenting for Lifelong Health program that Samba talked about is a truly remarkable program that's been being rolled out worldwide. That might be one way to engage G2 fathers, to be able to bring in these programs, provide them with some training, and break these intergenerational cycles. And then finally, the last thing I wanted to mention was income increases might also break this pathway in mothers. So like if you remember from just a few minutes ago, G2 mothers, they had income increases of greater than 5% over their typical yearly income. They saw that this intergenerational pathway was broken. I hypothesize it might be because it reduces parenting stress, which facilitates these parent rejection behaviors, and then also increases parent free time and cognitive resources to interact positively with their children because they don't have to worry as much about putting food on the table or meeting their family's needs. So maybe we're thinking about how income supplements could play a role in reducing parent rejection as well. And there's all sorts, you all have heard about some of this, including some of the trials here in the United States. There's all sorts of trials that are looking at those income supplement experiments as potential ways to increase parenting, decrease child mental health distress. So the big limitations I wanted to point out, the strengths were longitudinal and cross-cultural sample, which were amazing. And some of the limitations were the retrospective reporting of G1 parenting. It would be nice to have prospective reports of G1 parenting as well. A better measure of parenting program participation, the need for more great work like some of that's future RCTs, beyond just did you participate in a program? Did you not? Variable. And we only had parent report child mental health. So to have multi-method measures of child mental health would be wonderful. So that is the end of my presentation. I want to thank incredible funders, selfless participants, and the incomparable mentors and colleagues on this PAC team for the opportunity to be able to do this work. And if anyone's interested, I have a published paper citation, or just come on up to me afterwards. I can talk to a wall about this for like 4 hours. So feel free to come on up. I would love to talk to anyone who has questions.
Thank you very much, Drew. We'll save questions for Drew until the last part of the day today. And now I'd like to call Dora Juta, who's at in the University of Rome and is another important part of our bigger cross-cultural team. So sit back with the Do you hear me enough well without the microphone? From the very back? Okay, so good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for this opportunity to share some insights and some empirical results about a topic that I'm very passionate for, that actually has been inspired to me from the long time of working with the incredible PAC team group. So I'm going to talk about something that is related to the constructs that we have been examining within the parenting culture, but expands from that and capitalize upon data that are not part of the PAC sample. So what I mean with parental emotional socialization, I mean the different ways in which parents express their emotional experiences and respond to their children's emotional expressions. And it refers to the variety of strategies that parents may use to influence how their children experience emotion and deal with them. So what we know is that there are empirical data supporting that how parents react to children's emotional reactions influence their socio-emotional adjustment. And this is a picture that I will not go through, but it's just, I hope, a straightforward method to tell you that parental emotional socialization has been studied since a while, and it is within a conceptual model that talks about a complex situation around what are the multiple predictors of parental emotional socialization, the multiple outcomes, midterm, long-term from that, and there are many other ingredients that may shape the association between parental emotional socialization and predictors and outcomes. So today, what I would like to focus on is just some sort of variables associated with parental emotional socialization in terms of parents' reaction to children's emotion, parents' discussions about emotions, and parents' own emotional expression, which is also part of parental emotional socialization. In terms of methods used to examine parental emotional socialization, I'm here to mention just one of the questionnaire, typically self-reported by the parents or also adolescent reported and so on. So I'm talking about this questionnaire called Emotion as a Child Scale, which has been found to be most of the time used within North American sample. And it refers to 5 strategies that parents may use to deal with their children's emotions, such as reward, considered a supportive strategy that consists of helping and supporting their own children to deal with negative emotion, or override, which basically refers when parents are trying to distract their children from that emotion, maybe telling them you will see that things will go better, and so on. And then there are strategies that are considered non-supportive, such as punish, characterized by disapproval and adverse reaction toward the children's expression of negative emotion, or neglect, which I don't think I have to spend definition on it, and magnify, which refers to the parents expressing strong emotion after they have been exposed to their children's own emotion. And this parental expression of emotion may be or may not be congruent with the emotion previously expressed by their children. So what we know is that the supportive strategies are typically associated with the better adjustment of children in terms of socio-emotional development, whether the non-supportive strategies are associated with lower adjustment of those children. And so our idea has been, first of all, to be inspired by the parental neurostructure group and to try to see, to look for empirical evidence across countries. And what we could find was to consider some characteristics of the parental own emotionality and emotion regulation. So across all of the countries within the back sample, we found evidence cross-culturally and longitudinally in the transition from 13 to 15 that mothers who believe to be capable of dealing with their own anger in challenging and stressful situations, and mothers who were higher in irritability, later on were associated with higher use of harsh parenting strategies, so physical and verbal aggression strategies, higher irritability in their own adolescent children, which in turn predicted higher internalizing and externalizing problems. With internalizing problems, I mean anxiety depressive symptoms, social withdrawal, somatization. With externalizing problems, I refer to aggressive behaviors, delinquent behaviors. And another thing that we were able to look at actually during the pandemic, so we had some data from a sample of parents in Italy that were participating with us in this project of parental emotional socialization before the pandemic. And then we were able to reach them out to ask some questions after the pandemic started. So what emerged in this work is that, first of all, only on the Italian sample data, we could not isolate the 5 strategies that I talked with you about. But in terms of empirical analysis, there emerged 2 main factors, not surprisingly, supportive and non-supportive strategies. But the items were pretty well spread. So we had items about reward and overriding the supportive factor, and items about punish, neglect, and magnify in the non-supportive factor. So what emerged before and after the pandemic started in Italy, that the ones who, well, those parents who reported to use higher non-supportive parental emotion strategies before the pandemic, they were associated with higher difficulties in their children in dealing with emotion and also more problems in terms of internalizing and externalizing problems. Well, those parents that reported a lot of time to be more willing to engage in strategies such as the reward and override. After the pandemic started, were associated with children reporting to engage in adaptive strategies to deal with emotion regulation. So where are we now? We are inspired by the literature supporting that in terms of emotion development, that it is important also to acknowledge that different negative emotion or the positive emotion develop not exactly the same way. So we are interested in kind of understanding whether it's the same association between those strategies and emotional development of those skills. And so, and of course, we do know that we have to expand from the most typically used sample in our research question. So inspired by all of this, we implemented actually during the pandemic in a data collection with convenient sample of parents in those countries. And so those are anonymous questionnaire by parents who had to have children in between 6 and 18 years old. So by chance, the average age of the children within those samples are 14 for Italy, 12 for Colombia, 10 for Zimbabwe, and 11 for Azerbaijan. So we are in between late childhood and middle adolescence or top. So it's pretty homogeneous. Those are really preliminary data. The sample size is pretty nice. And we do have an interesting sample of others that engage in this data collection. Those are only parent records. And we also collect the data on the parental emotion socialization and the child behavior checklist and social desirability and some sociodemographic data. So what emerged here, another thing is that first of all, just to share, we shared the long tradition of working with cross-cultural data from the past. So we went through a long process of translation, effect translation, for example, in Azerbaijan, where we found the two main languages, Azerbaijani and Russian. And in Zimbabwe, we could capitalize on the English version of those scales. So interestingly, within each of those sites emerged the factorial structure of the two main factors for the parental emotion socialization scale. So it was not possible to isolate those 5 strategies. And very interestingly, in all those countries, we found a positive correlation among those strategies. So someone, I don't know, may think the ones who tend to use more the supportive strategies may use less the non-supportive strategies. No, what we found is a positive correlation, which can be aligned to a speculation in which in front of external, like a child who express their own emotion, parents typically try whatever they can. Sometimes it's supportive, sometimes it's not supportive. So that is something that is emerging with a correlation with the convenient sample data. And another very interesting thing that I want to focus on is that we could not find a scale that helped us to answer to the question, okay, so when a child instead express their joy and happiness, what do they do? And so we decided to have a focus group with some families just in Italy, and it was really nice what it emerged. And from that work, there was a set of items that we located and we administered. So here there are also preliminary data on that sense too. By chance, also in that case, we identified 2 factors in response of children's happiness, the non-supportive and less supportive practices. So now what I'm going to show you is the association between supportive and non-supportive strategies and internalizing and externalizing problems, focusing differently on the response of parents to children's anger, children's sadness, children's anxiety, and children's happiness. So similarly, for sadness, anger, and anxiety, we found a significant association between higher and supportive parental emotion strategies to respond to those negative emotions and more problems. here there is the positive correlation that I just told you about. Something different emerged for anxiety, which is this. So it's a positive association. We have been thinking through this, and let me tell you what is the point in which we are in our speculation, because of course we need more empirical analysis and more data. First of all, those are cross-sectional data. So we can't really say who comes first. Second, if I think how the question is phrased, it's that when your child is anxious, how often do you do? So that makes me be more willing to think first there is children's internalizing problems in the head of the mom or of the father, and then there is that. And what we're showing here is that in front of a negative emotion, like anxiety, differently from anger and sadness, parents may be more willing to respond in a supportive way. And that parents may not appear when children show anger and sadness. This is a speculation. Certainly, we need to look more in depth with empirical data. And very nicely, it emerged a clear pattern for supportive parental emotion strategies in response to happiness that are negatively associated with problems, whether unsupportive parental emotion strategies in response to happiness are related with positive association, especially with children's externalizing problems. I didn't say that these patterns emerged controlling for country, child and parent gender, parental work status, parental social disability, number of children in the household, and child age. And so, in conclusion, I hope we are in the good road to provide some evidence about the cross-cultural validity of the emotional child scale, to be able to spread the use of this scale more often around the world. And it's nice to see some very preliminary evidence that this pattern of parental emotional socialization and child adjustment applies in countries so different from the ones that we had. And it's nice to see also the contribution of the response to happiness that has been a little bit neglected in the literature, at least for what we have found. So it's nice to be able to contribute to that sense. Okay. Thank you very much, Laura. Thank you. We'll take a question for Laura until the question and answer time at the very end. Thank you very much, Laura. We are now going to turn to a presentation by Kirby Dieter-Deckard, who is at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And it's going to talk about pubertal timing and status as predictors of externalizing life problems.
Good morning, good to see everyone. The scope of my presentation is to start off by just giving an overview of the literature on pubertal timing and status effects controlling for age, and to discuss some of the challenges in the literature and talk about a couple of different analytic approaches we've started to apply in the PAC study and present some preliminary results and next steps. So this is a quick overview of pubertal status. It's important to think about biological changes associated with pubertal transition, as well as the social changes. The measure of puberty that we and most psychological and developmental researchers use doesn't really directly take into account the social changes. It focuses almost exclusively on, and I say almost exclusively for a reason, I'll address that in a moment, on self-report or a parent's report or a doctor's report or a nurse's report of physical changes based on candidate stages of physical development. These are directly observable. And the reason there is some comparativeness involved. So the child or the young adolescent is being asked to kind of think about themselves compared to themselves previously, like how they've been changing, and to also some of the measures think about how they compare to their peers. But meanwhile, what's actually happening or it also happening and outside of awareness is this complex series of biological changes. And I show this graph just to show this is just the a simplified circuitry graph or figure representing the initiation of pubertal changes. So when we think about timing, the starting of puberty, and the dashed lines represent inhibitory effects in the system, and the solid lines represent excitatory or activating parts of the system. And it's important to note as well that as puberty gets started, this shifts. So some of these inhibitory pathways become excitatory and activating, and new things come in to the system, and some of these go out of influencing the system. And the last thing I mentioned about this is just that the best way, I think, to think about each node in this system and the overall system is a brake and accelerator, and they're both operating all the time. So the puberty starts in part because the brake is being let off. It's a very active inhibition of puberty starting in the body very early in development, long before puberty starts. So it's really interesting just to think about it in that way, as a sort of brake and accelerator. And that's a general principle of many biological systems. And yes, it wears out the system. And that's why you always hear about repair, cell repair, and circuit repair. And so we also have built in there systems of repair because it wears out if you don't do that. And here are just some, now I'm afraid to touch too many buttons. Here are just some histograms of the self-reported pubertal status. It's a 1 to 4 scale based on the Peterson self-report measure. And I'm thinking, so it just, you can see how the distribution shifts from about 10 years of age to 13 years of age, 16 years of age, in ways that aren't surprising at all. And I was just thinking this morning, the PAC study from when we first started data collection, we're about 16 years old. Our participants are 22, so we're almost done with puberty. We almost made it. So that's cool. Yeah. The one other thing I wanted to point out, if you look at the distribution at 10 years, you'll see something that looks like a floor effect. And if you look at the distribution at 16 years, it looks like something that's like a ceiling effect. And that's in part baked into the measurement. But it's really important to think the actual biological changes and probably the social changes too that are occurring here are actually much more like a normal distribution. And that distribution is just shifting along whatever scale you're using. But our capacity to measure those changes and those individual differences later in pubertal development and early on in pubertal development are really limited with regard to our questionnaire approaches. So the general patterns of effects, early timing, and more advanced puberty for age show modest to moderate effects for higher externalizing and internalizing symptoms, riskier decision-making and risk-taking behavior, poor executive functioning and self-regulation, questionnaire and performance measures. Those are the most modest effects. And the results are really mixed in the literature for female-male differences in effects. And especially when you look at meta-analyses and systematic or scoping reviews, that's very clear. Often there's no difference. And that's actually one of the headlines here in our preliminary analyses. We're not really seeing any binary sex differences in the overall patterns of variation and covariation. Two of the big challenges, distinguishing early timing from pubertal status. So one way that you can think about kids who appear to be starting early is that they're ahead of the curve. So there's a real starting point here in terms of what you can see and what you can measure, but it might just be that those early starting kids are ahead of the curve. And you can distinguish that only later when you have the full sort of wide and normal distribution of characteristics of puberty. And so we'll talk about that a little bit, and the weird samples, which has come up already. We need more studies like the PAC for us to be able to look to see how consistent or inconsistent, similar or different these effects are across different countries, cities, cultures. So the analytic approach is a latent growth modeling approach. And today I'll present very preliminary results using just 2 time points, the 10-year self-assessment, self-report of puberty and the 13-year self-report. We actually have 5 or 6 ways of self-report, assessments of self-reporting pubertal status, but I wanted to start with this comparison just to make this check on early timing or pubertal status or age, just to see if we were seeing any kind of emergent pattern there. controlling for age differences, we do have quite a bit of age variation as well, so you need to control for that. And to also test for male, female, potential male, female differences in effects. We're extracting the intercept and the slope for the individual differences in trajectories of change, for a variety of developmental constructs, variables here. And I'll show some results just as an example. The important point here with regard to this approach with just these two pubertal assessments that we're trying to see, we're trying to estimate pubertal status at age 10, which we might, if that's all we had, we would think of as an early timing measure. And pubertal status at 13, which is more like a pubertal status for age measure. And we're looking at them both. So we're looking at the effects of both in the context of the effects of the other, of each one in the context of the effects of the other. And this is the other headline is it's all in our results so far, it's all pubertal status for age. There aren't any effects of early timing, so to say. Even when you don't include the age 13 pubertal score in the models, it's where we're seeing significant predictive effects. It's this age 13 pubertal status measure. So I'm going to show you just a couple of graphs showing some of the very preliminary results. These are unstandardized effects, so you can't look at these to make assessments of how big the effects are. In terms of standardized effects of pubertal status for age, the effect sizes are small. In terms of like Collins criteria. So this graph is showing that Stroop reaction times on a Stroop color word task from 3 to 6 to 9 years of age, those reaction times decrease. The adolescents get better, they get faster for correct trials. And this pubertal status effect at age 6 when they're about 13 years of age is suggesting that improvement in reaction time is faster for kids who are more advanced puberty for age. The preliminary results, I should mention too, I've just shown a greenish gray bar here just to show across the city. So the first column shows the result for the whole sample for which we have these data, and then showing across these cities, countries in the pack, the effects and the confidence intervals, the 95% confidence intervals are the bars there. And just to see how many of the effects fell within the range of the confidence interval range for the total sample, just as for visual inspection and descriptive purposes. These two slides show the results for externalizing and internalizing. And in both cases, we see a modest, it's not even statistically significant in the whole sample, increase in internalizing symptoms and externalizing symptoms in the PAC study. And what this suggests is that earlier pubertal status for age at age 13 predicts stronger increases in externalizing and internalizing, which is consistent with the literature. Sometimes there isn't an effect, and that's modeling issues. Sometimes the models don't converge with particular sites, and nothing surprising. Yeah, so these are the similar results for the externalizing problems. And then lastly, adolescent rated risk perception from the Benton questionnaire. This is basically a composite score reflecting the degree to which you perceive particular things. And riskiness becomes normalized as you move through adolescence. So that risk perception score decreases. You can see that in the pack. And the effect that we're seeing here in overall of the sample and in a few of the sites looks like as well, site-specific pattern of that decrease in perceiving risky things as risky is steeper for kids who are more advanced for age for puberty. So next steps are to finish all the analysis for all of our constructs measured. We have a host of other measures. These were just the ones I was able to get to. And it really is true. I checked only one other before time to come. And spatial working memory didn't show any effects of pubertal status or early timing at weight 10. And all the others showed significant effects of pubertal status, all controlling for age differences. So that's kind of interesting. But to do fuller analysis and to also include the longitudinal growth model for the pubertal measurement across all those waves in a multivariate latent growth modeling approach. And then also to look at potential moderators of pubertal status effects, things like family income and SES, and overall exposure to risk stressors and protective factors. Some work I do with another group that's where we're focusing on brain image measures as well as behavioral measures, performance measures of self-regulation, we're seeing strong interaction effects between chronic scarcity and things like income, housing, and security in a different sample study in terms of the pubertal status effects that we see on things, various measures of self-regulation and various measures of psychopathology. So I'm really eager for us to be able to look at this in a PAC study as well. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Kirby. We probably have time for one question for Kirby, and then we'll take a break and come back. Wrap it up. Did anybody have a question for Kirby? I think that for me, I think one of the most interesting things is thinking about kind of, absolute versus relative timing of puberty, especially in all of these cultural groups where it may be normative to hit puberty at different ages in different cultural groups. So,
yeah, and the different school transitions too. So that's and in some of the countries and cities of the PAC, those school transitions for age are standardized, right? And in some of the cities, countries in the PAC, it's not. It depends on the very local school district that you're in as to when those school transitions occur. So that's something I think we're going to have to deal with as well when we try to be competing explanations.
Thanks very sorry. So thanks very much for everybody who's spoken already. We've got another great lineup after the break. Next up is Ann Skinner, who is here at Duke, and she is going to talk about efforts related to COVID-19. And within about 2 weeks of the pandemic starting, had developed a measure that was rolled out in all of the 9 parenting across cultures projects and a number of other countries. So it's really led our COVID-19 related efforts.
I've been following Sue Vaughn's presentations for 14 years now. So as Jen said, I'm with the Center for Child and Family Policy here at Duke. I've been on Parenting Across Cultures since it started in 2008. It's been an amazing project, as Jen and others have said, but 4 R1 federally funded grants that have run for 15 years is not an easy thing for most researchers to do. So what I want to talk about today are other efforts I've been involved in. As Jen said, I became really interested in how COVID was impacting families around the world. And so what I want to do today is talk about 4 other very quick opportunities that I've gotten to be involved in international research. One with PAC and the rest without. PAC is a great game, but it's not the only game in town, especially for early career researchers. So what I hope to expand on today is opportunities for undergraduates, graduate students, early career researchers, and senior researchers who could be mentors, and show you some examples of how you at all levels can be involved in international research. The first thing that strikes me is if you pick up any sort of media in the last 2.5 years, if you haven't been living in a cave and you try to just Google COVID and adolescent mental health, in less than a second, you have 150,000 articles. If you put on your academic calendar and change that term to adolescent adjustment, you only go down to 58,000 articles. It's hard to make sense of what this means. The problems with this is that there's a lot of research out there. It's not all rigorous. There are many articles that when I'm researching to write about COVID are published the day after they are submitted. And so it's just a lot to sort through 150,000 articles about what's happening with kids and families around the world. Most of it, probably 80 to 90% of what we're reading is cross-sectional data. And I really think we need longitudinal data like we have with Parenting Across Cultures to be able to really figure out what is a pandemic effect and what is its developmental trajectory that might already be happening to other factors in their lives. We also have to take into account when you look internationally that there are varied government responses to the pandemic, even within the same countries. The United States is a great example of that, but it's not the only example of that around the world. Certainly we have different state regulations, but other countries based on region have different regulations as well. So I want to present 4 possible solutions to this sort of conundrum of how do we study COVID around the world internationally, and just give you some examples of how this can capitalize on existing partnerships you already have within your university or with agencies in the countries where we are. And I'll do that by pairing it with the research that we published or submitted or are working on coming out of it. So the first one is the Parenting Across Culture study, as Jen measured. On March 26th of 2020, we launched a measure that we added in the countries around the world. It was a very quick measure. We needed to be able to administer it in 3 minutes, 4 minutes if you do it orally in families. But it captured a couple of different things. One was self-perceptions for mothers, fathers, and children of how you're doing now compared to before the pandemic started. We've administered this measure 8 times over the course of the last 2.5 years, or will have when we finish collecting data in the spring of 23. But we also wanted to measure their response to the public health measures in their country and how confident they were that their government was handling that in an appropriate way, because we surmise that that makes a difference in how they comply with these regulations. And I'll share some of that research. I think more than many other pieces of research and topics, COVID-19 manuscripts require context. And this is one way to provide context. One example from one of the papers where we used 5 of the countries in the Parenting Cross-Culture study is to talk about what the pandemic deaths were in that country. So you can see at the time we published this study, they were widely different in those 5 countries in terms of what was happening at that moment. Those things looked really different 6 months later. This is another way to provide context. So this is how the new measure rolled out in Parenting Across Cultures. So the dotted line on the left is March of 2020. And then the sort of each bar is in each country when they very first administered the COVID-19 measure that we added to the study. So this is from one of our published papers, just to give the readers an idea of not everybody can minister on everything in the same day. Yes, it's kind of messy, but you also need to have this context to understand what's going on. And we get this from reviewers a lot, is we need more context about what was happening in each country. And I've seen that more in COVID papers than in other situations. So of the 4 papers that have used these are 4 of the papers, there's actually 5 or 6 now that have used the data from Parenting Across Cultures. You can see there's a wide variety of topics. The first one had to do with the paper that Jen led about this confidence in government impacting complying with public health requirements. There were also 2 papers that I worked on where we looked at how earlier things in adolescence moderated the relation between your perception of distress, stress, and disruption during the pandemic and adolescent or young adult adjustment 3 years later. And we found a couple of interesting things there. And then one of our colleagues in Macau published a really interesting study that saw that this pro-social altruistic behavior had a protective effect in this sort of slow life history. He's an evolutionary psychologist. So that's a really interesting paper to read if you're looking for something sort of more out of the norm in terms of adolescent mental health. So the second example that I'm going to share with you is an experience I was involved in starting in 2020 called the Junior Researcher Program. And this is the joint effort between, it's actually a nonprofit that is run by an economist at Columbia University and in consort with Cambridge University in the UK. So this brings together a couple of different sort of groups of people. So I was the supervisor of a research team of 6 international junior scholars. I applied to the program and I posted an idea of a study I wanted to run around COVID-19. And then students, undergraduate, upper undergraduate students, juniors and seniors, psychology students, and then graduate students in psychology from around the world applied to be on one of 6 teams that they wanted to participate with to run and launch a study. And it began with a 1-week summer school that was supposed to be in Siena, Italy in June of 2020. Our entire program, unfortunately, for 13 months was online, but I had the opportunity to go back this July as part of the reunion, and this is the group, the new cohort, the 2022 cohort. So they run this every year, and it has a couple of different pieces. The 1-week summer school launch is a very popular model in a lot of European organizations where you just get together and you work with your team on your project 12 hours a day, designing this project in sort of this intense 1-week summer school. And then we continue to meet. We had what they called a Junior J meeting in January. It was supposed to be in Portugal, but it was again online where they did some statistical trainings and we checked in about our projects. Early on, I met with the team about every week, and then it went to every 2 weeks and then every month. All the studies are required to be pre-registered. There's an opportunity for students to participate in a 1-month intense internship at Cambridge in the UK. And the internship they did last year was just published in Nature at 172 authors. So it's an incredible effort if you're interested in working with large research teams. The conference then takes place at the end of that. So the entire research team from the summer school the year before we'll come back and present, disseminate, and then talk about plans for publication. So this is kind of what it looks like on a calendar basis. This was the team I worked with. The problem that we had when we launched the project is we wanted to do original data collection. COVID really slowed that down, and I wanted them to have a publication experience. So we actually did 2 projects. The first project was that we used the parenting cross cultures data. I wanted them to get their hands in data, and we were having a really hard time collecting it in their home countries. So I said, let's at least go look at data that we have. So this is a paper that we worked on and published together earlier this year, very similar to the one I shared from the Parenting Cross Cultures group as well, that positivity, future orientation, and psychological control during adolescence moderated the relation between pandemic disruption and young adult adjustment. The sort of surprise factor here was that psychological control operated in a way that it doesn't typically. It typically has really negative associations with adolescent adjustment. We have some theories about why that may have looked different during the pandemic. So this is just what that looks like in a different graphic form. You can see the lines for those with low psychological control versus high psychological control. So the second example was what I really wanted them to have, which was the experience with original data collection. So this is the study that we designed as a team. Again, the same sort of predictor and outcome, looking at disruption and internalizing behaviors, but instead they really wanted to look at parental depression, parental anxiety, parental warmth. So parenting behaviors, parenting characteristics. This is the sample. We collected data from about 100 families each in Germany and Slovakia. One of the most difficult data collections I've ever experienced. Aside from some of the Dell data we tried to collect at age 17, it took nearly a year to collect this data. So that's actually going to be a very complicating factor in terms of the sort of analysis of this. But this is with our colleague in Slovakia, just to give you an example, contacted 75 schools. She's from Bratislava, contacted 75 schools in Slovakia to try to get surveys out. And we got 4 responses from people. So we had to go other routes in order to collect data. Our very preliminary results of the paper that we're working on right now is that controlling for child gender, parental depression, parental anxiety, parental warmth, peer support, SES, and current levels of internalizing behavior on the Akabach, we found that low parental support had it was a moderating factor in terms of the relation between pandemic disruption and their changes in internalizing behavior. It's been really difficult looking at the PAC data and other projects to figure out what's going on with social support, either from parents or from peers. So this was kind of an interesting finding to us, and we're still trying to digest it. The third example I want to give you is a project that actually both Jen and I are involved in, sort of a joint effort between the Society for Research in Adolescence, the John Templeton Foundation, and ICDSS, which is a consortium of developmental science societies. And this is sort of an 18-month foundation-supported mentor-mentee model. So we work in pairs internationally. So there are 17 mentees, 17 mentors. We meet as a group across the globe. We met at SRA in New Orleans in March. And the fellowship, this is what the fellowship sort of looks like for me in terms of how this is played out. So I have 2 projects that I'm working on. One is I'm working with actually a colleague of Dario Martinez in the University of Florence in Tuscany, Italy. And she had a data set that was, again, from a study that was not designed for COVID. It was a study of non-suicidal self-injury, but it launched in January of 2020. So she has just pre-COVID data. And then, like Parenting Cross Cultures, they added COVID measures to it at time 2, which was 12 months later, and then time 3, which was 12 months after that. We completed a longitudinal growth curve analysis when I was there in July, Zooming with Jennifer Godwin every 5 minutes to ask questions about our model. So that's one side of the project, and I'll share those results in a second. The other side of the project is that I teamed up with 2 other dyads, so 2 other mentor-mentee pairs, and spent some time with Carmen Keeley and Metta Ranta, and with Ingrid Schoen also in Ireland this summer, so that we could look at 3 different data sets together. So one of the issues that we realized is we don't always need to collect new data. There's a lot of data out there. What we're not doing is integrating the different countries. We're publishing country-specific papers that talk about COVID and isolation. And so what we did is we sat down and painstakingly went through every question in the USA data set, the UK data set, and the Italy data set, and found where there was overlap and similarity. So how can we publish a paper that looks at those 3 together, even though the studies were never designed to be together? I can tell you that was a pretty painstaking process, but we actually came up with some overlapping constructs. So we found out that we could limit all our samples to mid-adolescence. We found that internalizing symptoms did increase across time. This is actually from the longitudinal, this is from the single model, just the data in Tuscany. And this longitudinal growth curve analysis paper, actually, the findings were that we're looking at the co-development of these symptoms. So when you're looking at a developmental trajectory, we found that the impact of COVID stress was over and above predictive of the internalizing symptoms and lower levels of regulatory self-efficacy during the pandemic. So it was really a matter of incredible timing that they were able to have this just pre-pandemic data. And that the T3 levels, so the time 3 levels 24 months after the pandemic started were much more pronounced than the 12-month levels. So the effect of the pandemic was continuing to accumulate. Looking at the 3 study collaboration together, you can see these lists of sort of things we found in common. They were all longitudinal studies. They all assessed anxiety and depression at multiple waves. We lucked into that. So we each can look at pre-COVID levels and post-COVID levels of anxiety and depression, self-regulation and social support. And so those are the research team members there. And then very preliminary results, this is sort of hot off the presses, August 24th from our analysis then, is that time 1 anxiety was really the best predictor of time 2 anxiety, but even controlling for all those other things. So what we're trying to figure out is why are things like social support and these other things not making the difference that we hope they're going to make in terms of the longitudinal data. So again, context matters. We just grabbed some quick numbers from our sample. The one that strikes me, so this COVID experience variable is just, did you know someone close to you that had COVID? And you can see how widely those numbers vary across the sites. And that's an important context to keep in mind as we're looking at this data. So again, when you think about looking at COVID papers and COVID data, the context is really, really important in terms of the study. So across these 4 different international research projects, sort of thinking in my head, what does this mean for COVID in general? The role of social support is still really unclear to me. I don't think we've got a good handle on what's going on with peer support and parent support. There's some inklings that parental support matters, that makes sense. That's probably who they were with more when they were in lockdown. But it's still kind of a mixed bag. Both perceived and measured. So perceived being, I think my internalizing has been increasing since before the pandemic, and pre-post levels on measures of internalizing behavior, so real and perceived, are increasing across time. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. And it is exacerbated by COVID stress or disruption reported by the adolescent and young adults. What we see across these different projects and studies are some inroads to resilience. Interpersonal ones, like the parent-child relationship, so parental warmth. The study where we looked at how they resolve conflict, so if it's resolved in a constructive way rather than stonewalling or walking away and that sort of thing, that seems to have a protective effect. Government confidence in the pandemic response seems to be protective, and then just these sort of pre-COVID buffers, like adolescents having, higher levels of future orientation and well-being. From a strategy standpoint, the things that we've learned about working across collaborations, certainly it's a better representation of the world's population. Drew and others have mentioned that, sort of the non-tiered countries. It also provides both EMIC and EDIT perspective. So I'm not going into Ireland and using the Irish data without having an Irish colleague to put that into some context with me. And she's actually a sociologist, so it's great to have her on the project. I believe she's on Zoom, so hello to Carmen, but to have that context from a qualitative point of view, I think is really important during COVID as well. Seeing the origin of the variants between and within countries is something we can do when we look across countries like this. Advancing the UN Sustainable Development Goals, I think, is an important piece of this when we look at child health. And just the opportunity to have leadership and mentee experiences. So one of the students on my project in this junior researcher program was a Duke undergraduate. And it was, I don't think it was a project that they typically would have found out about, had I not shared the information I had from Europe with the psychology and neuroscience department here. So it gave undergraduates and graduate students an opportunity to interact across countries that they wouldn't have typically had. So I'm happy to talk about any of these projects with anyone, but I think there are lots of opportunities out there for undergraduates, early career researchers, and graduate students to sort of move beyond academic and geographical borders to study COVID, because I think it's so important that we not remain within our communities and looking at the impacts.
Thank you very much, Anne. We're going to save questions for Anne until the very end of today. And we're turning to another colleague here from Thailand. And Don, please come up. So I'm going to talk about Lana parenting, and she will tell you what Lana parenting is too.
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Sang. We are called for short. I work in.
Let's get your I'll put it in.
Okay, I'll start from. Okay, I'm responsible for Thai side, Thailand side, which we collect the data in Chiang Mai, in the the north part of Thailand. Having said that, Thailand, we have like four parts. Chiang Mai in the north part, and they have like different, I would say, unique culture from the other part of Thailand. So let me show a bit. I have to bring you back like 700 years. The reason why we have a unique culture that sometimes different from the central part of Thailand, because we was established here, and then Thailand is here. Thailand at that moment, we don't call it Thailand because for Thai era, and then you can see the timeline. And we established in 1296, and then we was colonized by Myanmar for 200 years, and later we was colonized by Siam or Thailand, and gradually we become part of Thailand later. So we have some part that share the same culture and different culture as well. Okay, in the term of culture, especially Lana, that's why we call Lana the north part of Thailand, and what we have next right now. So this is Thailand, or it's Thailand, and Lana area would be here. Like if we go back like 700 years ago, Lana would be include part of Myanmar and part of China. But now, okay, we study over here, and Chiang Mai here, around here that we study. And thank you for Drew that you mentioned about Gen 1, Gen 2, and Gen 3. Yes, Gen 1, Gen 2, Gen 3. Gen 1 and Gen 2 we quite present or express our traditional Lana traditional quite a lot. But at Gen 3, they have a complaint about Gen 2 and Gen 1 that, oh, you didn't, practice our Lana traditional, whatever. So I have to, yeah, just whatever. But in our Gen 3, they didn't practice Lana tradition, they didn't explain it anymore. So when have the qualitative base, so I just add more answer question about that, and let's see what the answer is. So the first question I asked them, who is the Lana people? The participant, the youth that I select would have to be born in Lana, in the north part of Thailand. They have to be raised and parenting at least 18 years in Chiang Mai as well. So I asked them who's the Lana people. They have 4 categories that they mentioned. The first thing they mentioned about where they born. If they born in the north part of Thailand, they consider themselves as a Lana people. And another dimension is about a daily living, like food. There's a different language. This is Thai alphabet, but this is the Lana alphabet. That's quite different. Dress like this. You can see like dress is me and my sister. We dress quite traditionally. But this is my niece, and this is Joy, my colleague here. Quite a modern, a bit of modern Lana. Another is ritual and which we call spiritual belief that in north part of Thailand is still quite have a strong belief about spirit, and I don't want to say ghost, spirit would be better. Yeah, and another is characteristic, which is the next slide. So I asked them about the Lana characteristic. So they have many answer, but I try to group them. And the obvious one is humble. They think people from north part of Thailand is more humble. Really? Kind and nice. And another thing that's quite that people from the other part of Thailand portray us is the soft heart that we are like, okay, hi, something like that. And another thing is easygoing, or we use the word in Thai possible like, okay, take it easy, don't be rushed, that's fine, something like that. That's the characteristic that we use perceive. And another question is, this is really important for me, surprise for me too, and maybe can answer part of Kirby presentation a bit. It's about, so I asked them that how you was parent from your family. And one thing they mentioned is no rules. And I said, how could it be how the family function without rules? They said, well, we have rules, but rule is not established unless they have unpleasant situation happen before. Like I can go out late and I'm not sure when I'm gonna be back. My parents would say, don't be late. But what late actually means 6 p.m., 7 p.m. My parents would be, 6 p.m. is late for me, maybe 12, 1 a.m. in the morning, something like that. If I come back home like 1 a.m. in the morning, I'm gonna receive consequence. And I will know later that, oh, that actually it's too late for me. So they have no rule established unless the unpleasant situation happen. And even the rule established, it's not like it's a firm rule. It's quite a flexible rule. And it depends on your parents' mood. If they are in a bad mood, it could be a firm rule. But if in a happy mood, maybe I can go with it. But how could it be happen a family without rules? How could the child follow you and respect you? I maybe go back to the Lana characteristic. We are so compromised. So even they have not a firm rule, and rule could be equal recommendation and advice. Maybe parents don't have to be so firm, but we know that we should do it. They are compromised with us, so we compromise them as well. That's what the good person perceive, no? Okay. So another thing that is it the Lana culture, is it important for you, and will you continue practice it? All of them say yes, but about it's important, but how to practice it, it's depend. I mean, depend on. Some say that yes, it's really important, but I don't participate that much right now. For example, we have like the important festival we call Songkran festival. Also, Thailand, the other part of Thailand has it as well, but it's really important in the north part of Thailand because kind of like Christmas, that family gathering together. But if you have work to do, you don't have to go back. It's okay. Your parents will understand. If you have like work to do and study to have or you had an exam, it's okay. They will find with you. And some of them say yes, if they really understand about the reason why we have to practice it. Like I told you, like we have the creative spirit, which is sometimes it may not scientific and rational for some of you. They said if they understand why they have to do it, they may practice it, but if don't, why they bother or something like that. And another question is, how does the Lana culture deliver to the parenting? How they feel it? They said the parent never teach them directly how to practice, how to behave. the main approach they use is modeling. Like for example, this one is Gen 1, this is Gen 2, this is Gen 2. But this is Gen 1, Gen 2, and Gen 3. It's modeling, it's not like teaching. And I think this is bring back me like really concerned because this is their youth perception. And I also interview the parent perception as well. The parent also feel like it's okay that you're gonna practice this or not. And they didn't need to teach you directly. We just want to show you if you want to do it, just do it. If you don't want to. So maybe I wonder maybe the complaint that the Gen 2 complain a lot about like, oh, the Gen 3 didn't practice Lana culture anymore. Maybe not because of the Gen 3. Gen 1 and Gen 2 have responsibility as well to teach them. So I'm really struggle about working about culture a bit. Yeah, I find that it's not like a solid thing. It's really fluid for me. It's like go everywhere. So when I'm thinking about the culture, especially Lana culture, I don't think Lana culture in my generation would be the same as the third generation or in another generation. Culture have to be adjusted, and the generation will choose by themselves which one they're gonna practice or follow. So it could be adjust and continue. That's what I would say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Don. We can probably do one question for Don now, and then we can save other questions for later. But is there anyone who wants to ask a question of Don right now?
Yeah, great. It's such a fascinating, it was so amazing to see what the qualitative piece of data collection adds to this project and how rich that data collection is. And one thing that popped into my head that I was wondering about as you were talking was how just speculating, how do you think generation 3 would adapt Lana culture and its own parenting practices? Do you have any guesses?
Actually, that's gonna be the fourth generation. I asked them, but
Oh,
they will
okay.
continue it.
Yeah,
That is if it's understandable, if they see like it's rational.
yeah.
Yeah, they may practice it.
Uh-huh.
But like for example, like the daily living like food and dress, they may continue it.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's represent. But about the belief about the spiritual thing, some of them might
I see.
yeah. That's what they say.
Yeah.
Thank you, Don.
Thank you. Thank you.
Next up is Susanna, who is from Duke and one of Suzanne. And Suzanne is going to be talking about data in multiple countries, not using CAP data, but a different data set that she'll tell you about.
I am a postdoc with the Parenting Cross-Culture Study. I've been starting to work with the CDC Violence Against Children surveys. And so this is going to be some of the preliminary data from analysis that I'm doing with this with that data set. So there are a number of consequences to victimization to violence against children, including mental health issues and behavioral issues later in life in adolescence and young adulthood. However, there's more limited evidence on whether there are sensitive periods for first exposure to these kinds of adverse experiences, and whether or not first exposure to adverse experiences are related to how they're related to adverse outcomes. This is particularly there's limited evidence if sensitive periods differ by the type of violence and the type of perpetrator of that violence. And it's particularly limited in low and middle income countries where there's also an undue burden of victimization of violence and also adverse mental health and behavioral outcomes. So there's high prevalence of violence against children in sub-Saharan Africa. A study found that 80% of children 12 to 14 and 50% of children 15 to 17 had experienced any kind of violence in the past year. There are other risk factors that put them at high risk of violence victimization, such as high rates of poverty and of orphanhood. And there's a high burden of mental health and adverse behavioral outcomes among young adults. It's estimated that 50% of adolescents had at least one substance the past year, and 50% who drank alcohol engaged in heavy drinking. And there's also a high burden of mental health issues in sub-Saharan Africa that are often undertreated. One study got that 10% found that 10% of participants are qualified for a psychiatric diagnosis. So my research questions, to address these gaps, I conducted secondary data analysis of the violence against children surveys from species. And my research questions were among youth aged 19 to 24, which I consider young adults. What's the prevalence of different types of violence, child victimization before the age 12, between 12 and 18, and after 18? And then what's the relation of the age at first exposure of each type of child victimization to young adult risk factors? And is the effect of different for different types of victimization? And also, what are the potential protective factors that moderate the effect? So the sample were 6 countries from the CDC Violence Against Children survey. They have a total of 16 countries, and the data is publicly available. If you're interested in using these data, I'd be happy to talk to you. It's been a bit of a learning process, because they're not standardized 100% across countries. But these are nationally representative cross-sectional household surveys of 13 to 24-year-olds and one adult caregiver, which is usually a mother. And I chose 6 countries. I did not use Swaziland or typo because they had comparable variables of interest. And my analytical sample was young adults aged 19 to 24. For this analysis, I used 5 variables for first experience of childhood violence. 3 items for sexual abuse, 4 for physical violence for a caregiver, 3 for emotional violence for a caregiver, another 4 for physical violence from an adult community member, and then I think 3 for peer violence. And my outcomes were a scale of mental health that was the reference period the past 30 days. Suicidal ideation and or self-harm, that was the ever experience. Drug use in the past 30 days and alcohol use in the past 30 days. The hypothesis moderators or social support for friends. The variable I think is that I feel comfortable talking to my friends about issues that come up in my daily life. How close they rated feeling to their mother and how close they rated feeling to their father. And I controlled for sex education, age, whether or not they were a maternal orphan before the age of 18, and if they ever experienced intimate partner violence. And I conducted a multivariate regression in this data, and I compared the marginal effects across each age for each type of violence. And the outcomes were, the models were loaded for suicidal ideation, alcohol use and drug use, and GLM for log length for mental health. I adjusted for the standard areas by country for by county for clustering and control for country, and used standard errors. So, results, the pooled sample size was 13,000, quite large, but ranging from 748 in Kenya to almost 4,000 in Lesotho. And the average age was 21 years. The percent female was 64%, ranging from 25% in Nigeria to 91% in Zimbabwe. I think that variation was that different countries had different priorities on who to sample. And so I think Zimbabwe were mostly interested in girls for other reasons. 12% of participants were maternal orphans, ranging from 1% in Zambia to 23% in Lesotho. And 21% were paternal orphans, ranging from 2% in Malawi to 39% in Lesotho. And so 12% of around 10% of participants experienced sexual violence for the first time between before 12 and also between from 12 to 18 and then also above 18, whereas a smaller percent experienced before the age of 12, but this did vary by country. And so 12% experienced physical violence from a caregiver before age 12, with less between 12 and 18 and a small percent after 18. 4% experienced emotional violence from a caregiver before the age of 12, around 7% between 12 and 18, and 6% above 18. And for physical violence in the community member, 7% experienced before age 12, 4% between 12 and 18, and 2.6% after 18. And for peer violence, 5% before age 12, 7% between 12 and 18, and around 5% after age 18, but these did vary a bit by country. In terms of the outcome, 12% of participants reported self-harm and or suicidal ideation. The mental health measure ranged from 1 to 5, and 5 being the most severe, and the average was 1.63. 30% of participants drank in the past 30 days, but this did vary a lot by country, and drug use was pretty low in general. So we found that so in general, the mental health is the average change in log odds for one unit in the predictor, and the other ones are odds ratios. So we found that sexual violence was linked to poor mental health and increased odds of self-harm and suicidal ideation, but there was no difference, significant difference by age of exposure. Additionally, physical violence from a caregiver was significantly related to poor mental health, higher odds of suicidal ideation or self-harm, higher odds of drug use, but there's no difference by age of exposure for most of these, except those who first experienced physical violence from a caregiver after age 18 had higher odds of self-harm and suicidal ideation compared to the other ages of exposure. Additionally, there's a greater effect of physical violence from a caregiver if you experienced it after age 18, the closer they reported the age of their mother. So being close to one's mother actually exacerbated their suicidal ideation risk. For emotional violence from a caregiver was significantly related to poor mental health, self-harm and suicidal ideation, and alcohol use, but there was no difference by age of exposure. But we did find a moderation effect. The effect of experiencing emotional violence on alcohol use before the age of 12 was lower for those who reported being closer to their father. So it actually lowered one's risk of alcohol use if you've been exposed to violence before the emotional violence from a caregiver before age 12 if you were closer to your father. Also found that physical violence from a community member was not significantly related to any of the outcomes. And peer violence was significantly related to poor mental health, but this was not significantly different by age of exposure. So in general, there are many effects of each type of violence exposure to the mental health and behavioral outcomes, but most of these did not differ by the age of exposure, which was surprising, and I need to do more analysis to understand this. However, we did find that the difference between age, there was a difference between age of exposure for those who had experienced physical violence from a caregiver after the age of 18. This could be that there was a low percentage of those who experienced after 18. 21% of the sample experienced physical violence from a caregiver, but only 1.6% after age 18. So it could be that this was non-normative in the society, so there was a bigger effect if they experienced this. And this effect was exacerbated by how close they were to their mother. So it was possible that they were more likely to perceive that physical violence from a caregiver as rejection if they were closer to their mother. However, there's a limitation that we don't know who the perpetrator is, so we don't know if it was the mother, father, or another caregiver. Also, there's an issue of temporal validity because we don't know exactly when after age 18, and they were age 19 to 24. So it could be that they already had suicidal ideation, especially since that variable was ever experienced. So it could be that those who already experienced suicidal ideation were more likely to perceive actions as physical abuse from a caregiver, and then also more likely to and it was also surprising that we saw this results in terms of suicidal ideation, but not mental health. We also had in terms of emotional violence for caregivers, it was related to poor mental health, self-harm, and suicidal ideation, and alcohol use. But there's no difference by age of exposure. But there's a protective effect of being close to one's father. If one experienced violence from a caregiver before the age of 12 for the outcome of alcohol use. And so there are a number of strengths and limitations of the study. We were able to look at the age of first exposure in a sub-Saharan African sample and included possible protective factors, but there was some retrospective reporting, so there's some temporal validity, but it's cross-sectional data. There was also low endorsement of drug use. This could be actual low endorsement or underreporting due to stigma. One thing they did do well is talked about like having different substances in terms of like glue or paint, which is common drug that's used in sub-Saharan Africa and used. That's usually not measured in other data sets. So I think that was really interesting in addition to the different drugs that they listed. There was some missing data on alcohol that I need to look into. The effects could also be different for girls and boys, especially looking at how close they were to their father and mother. And there could be different sensitive periods other than we define them, like before age 12 to 18, and above 18. So in future directions, in terms of analysis, I'm going to be looking more at sensitivity analyses for missing data. I'll be comparing countries in our multiple group analysis and also doing multiple group analysis for boys and girls. Or anything else that you guys recommend, I'm kind of open to any ideas. But in general, we found different effects of different types of violence on mental health and behavioral outcomes. Some were moderated by parental closeness, but that direction depended on the age of first exposure. And a general early ideas we could potentially target interventions on parental relationships to young adults, which is I think less explored, and I think it pairs well with the qualitative data we're doing in PAC in terms of exploring family dynamics of young adults with their parents and what that was from. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Susanna. So now we have the opportunity to open it up for questions for Susanna, but also for all of our panelists who are here. And we also have some folks from the Parenting Across Cultures Project who are here who didn't speak. And so if you have questions about things related to the Parenting Across Cultures Project more broadly, in addition to the specific talks today, all of us are happy to address those kinds of questions. So questions, suggestions, feedback.
Yeah. The questions for several of you, but for Drew, I was wondering a couple of things about yours. Did you disaggregate any of the results by those rejection domains, like warmth versus the negative?
You know, that is such a good question. And I did not for this paper, but we did for another paper looking at pro-social behavior. And found differential effects on pro-social behavior in magnitude, but not direction of those different behaviors. That is such a good question. That's a good next step in those analyses, because it would, depending on what you find, would suggest the type of parenting skills that you're going to be teaching a parent or something like that. So that's a really good question.
Yeah, all the reverse scoring of warmth always.
Yes.
Me when we don't look at it as a sort of peak. So,
Yeah, that
yeah.
makes sense.
I think. And my other quick question for you was, how many of the G2 dads said they were in a parenting program? Did you have any idea about what they meant by that? I was thinking about Somebot's observation that they're very hard to read. So I was wondering what they were. Who were these dads who happened upon them?
Yes, I can answer the first part of that better than the second part. So if I remember the relative frequency, it was higher than I thought. It was somewhere between like, I think 10 and 20% of dads. That you identified the biggest limitation for me in that entire study with your second question, which is just we don't really have a better idea of what type of parenting program that. I mean, that could be anything from an online, say it's research, something online and gets better parenting program, to being involved in something like parenting for lifelong health. And so I think that's a future direction in this study. And then there's other studies that are going on at the center looking at effects of a rigorous randomized controlled trial designs for each of these types of protective factors that do get at that question a little more. That work from Ken and others fast track study, which has some very interesting findings about how these the implementation of this rigorous parenting intervention in one generation winds up improving the family environments that generation establishes in adulthood for mothers, but not fathers, is what we found. So I can talk more about that part of it in sort of a more rigorous measurement of what a particular type of parenting program would be. But in this sample, we only have that one single questionnaire right now. Yeah.
Yeah, well, encouraging results that if we can get them, then.
That's right. That was the sort of takeaway for me with this work was I was really worried, and then the paper wound up trying to write with what I don't want is for people to look at this and say parenting programs don't work for mothers because our measure isn't great. But I think the encouraging news is even with a sort of a very coarse measure, we're seeing effects for fathers, which is preliminarily encouraging.
Good question. Suha, could you talk a little bit, because it's really related as a follow-up point, about the Better Parenting program in Jordan and what that program did to target fathers? I think a lot of people in this room would be interested in that work.
So in Jordan, we had the program that was established or started in 2003. And it went back to different stages. And it was the time I returned actually in 2007 in Jordan, where we had the peak of this program, and it was up and running. And as I mentioned before, it was running well for families and for mothers mainly. But there was the difficulty with targeting fathers to participate in such a program. And it was all over from that in Jordan, in the rural areas, remote areas, and city centers. So what we did is that we thought about different modalities, how we can target fathers, where fathers can be found more. So in Jordan, more than 95% of the population are Muslims. So there's a lot of mosques, and the Friday prayers is something that most of the people they are keen to attend, especially the men, right? So we established connection with the Ministry of Islamic Affairs, and they were open to the idea. So UNICEF and other partners, in addition to the Ministry of Islamic Affairs, they would work together, and they developed this manual that is aligned with the Better Parenting program, but it's more focused on the spiritual aspects of the parenting and how this can be linked to the actual Better Parenting program. Because the research shows, the literature and the practice show that like people who listen and believe in things that closer to their faith and religion and the spiritual aspect of it. So we use that. Like for example, in talking about the physical corporal punishment, for example, we use citations from the Holy Quran and from Prophet Muhammad's, saying that we shouldn't do that. Things that focus more on positive discipline, for example, this is like one aspect, and the family is center of everything, and all of around it. So all of this was cited in this sub manual. And all of those features who go to the Friday prayers were trained on this manual, and the UNICEF was heavily involved in this actually. And we were able to train like a really big number of those features, and everyone like what really was open to this idea. And it was up and running, and there was like the parenting issue was in the heart of these Friday prayers and all over the kingdom. And then when it comes to the evaluation of this program, it was found really effective, and we reached, and this impacted the families actually in a very nice and positive way. And still the manual is still now like up and running, and they are still using it. And the scaling of such programs, not only in Jordan, is spread to other countries now in the UAE and Abu Dhabi. We're working on another similar manual, not only for Muslims, because as I mentioned in Abu Dhabi, there is like diverse number of like many, like you can imagine. There is there is Muslims, there is Jew, there is Christians, there is Sikh, Hindus, and there is temples for all of these, people. So then we're trying now to develop such manual that part of it's talking about the general aspect, of course, of parenting and their childhood, and the other part is like specific parts to each one's faith, because although the messages are the same all over, but the specific, where we can rely on evidence from each one's faith is also will be present. So this is in a nutshell what we did in Jordan, and it was really successful, and we're trying to do in other parts of the region. Thank you. Do you have any questions?
Thanks, Suha. I thought that's a great example, I think, of specific strategies that worked to get fathers involved. That was a matter of kind of thinking beyond the traditional kind of existing model. So thank you. Other questions for anyone? Please.
I have a question for Sambar. So I'm really interested in grandmothers being a pathway for parenting interventions to sort of change norms. And so I'm interested in the fact that sample that you've discussed, over 50% for grandparents, a lot of the grandmothers, I'm assuming. And so I would be curious to learn more about the context of whether the parents are also in the same families, or if they're leaving for work in a more urban area, and also maybe some challenges of having grandmothers come to parenting interventions, and how their health might moderate or affect their ability to partake in some activities, etc. So it'd be just great to learn more.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yes, a lot of grandparents are involved in this because the parents often in the rural area, they move to the city or another province to find work. And it's typical, especially in the northeastern part of Thailand, where poverty is higher. The usual concern is that the grandparents are not in good health, not really, not like doting grandparents, that typical image that we have. They just tend to basic needs, feed them, get them to school, and then often rely on punishment, or and then there's a high prevalence of neglect as well, emotional and physical. So it's concerning, to say the least. Yeah. So, did I answer all your questions?
Yeah, I guess I'm curious, how you've been able to, work with grandparents to address neglect or some of these, parenting, given that they're the primary caregiver in some of these contexts.
We can only try to increase their interest and awareness of the importance of parenting to them, because a lot of them are just not aware. They just think of only the basic needs and more concerned with other things. And also in the northeastern part of Thailand, I've read other studies done by local researchers. The grandparents are also, apart from not being very healthy, they also have problems with alcohol, with gambling. And in Thailand, gambling is also a big problem. The government, they run lottery, and people wouldn't be very preoccupied with that because they have this fantasy of instant wealth, right? A lot of people have that. So yeah, parenting is not the priority for the grandparents. Just do it because they have to do it. That's the general perception, I think. Sorry
Some of these are resonating with my own personal experience.
Thanks for the question, based on that. Tina, could I put you on the spot a little bit? Tina is a long-term collaborator on the Parenting Across Cultures project, who is in Italy, but she's also been very involved in the Colombia site. Our colleague from Colombia actually had to fly out really early this morning, so she's not here with us today. But Tina, since we haven't really heard about Colombia today, if it's not too much to put you on the spot, would you mind talking a little bit about your, the context and some of the work you've been doing with Liliana in Colombia?
Yes. Good morning, everybody. I was not spoken. I'm here. It's fine, and a bit of my experience in Colombia with the colleague that she's not here right now. She left this morning, Liliana. We've been doing this collaboration. We have this collaboration from Colombia since the beginning of the park project, because at that time, Jennifer asked me for a South American site, if I knew some people from, at that time I was collaborating with Bolivia. And meanwhile, Liliana applied for our PhD program in Italy. And I said, let's take a site where we have direct collaboration. So we started this collaboration, and PAC started in Colombia with, I think, with a next participation. In addition, with Liliana in Colombia, in Medellin, and also another part of Colombia, the Caribbean part, we have developed, for many years, we have been studying social behavior, and after a longitudinal studies conducted in Italy, Rome, we get to the point to develop an intervention program and enhancing prosocial behavior within the class context. So we developed this program in Italy, and then Liliana wanted to disseminate or to pilot this program in Colombia. The reality of this program is working very well, especially in sites where most vulnerable people live. Why the prosocial behavior program is working there? Because as you probably know, Colombia is a context. I used to be an high conflict context, political and violence. There is a fight between group of extreme left and a group, paramilitary group that were military, that the government of Colombia during the narco traffic era created this group, parallel group to the government. Now the two groups are all involved in narco traffic. So this means that still active this kind of violence. However, Colombians have established since 5 years a process of peace. So they wanted to overcome this conflict situation and the pro-social key, being putting on emphasis on the positive side was very well accepted in terms of the social situation at the moment. So at the moment we are continuing this program and we have a very, at least we see an improvement in pro-social behavior and also reducing of bullying and violence in the school context. So it's a promising program that this is a little bit my experience with Colombia.
Thank you, Tina. Sorry to put you on the spot like that, but I'm glad that to hear a little bit more about the work in Colombia.
I didn't volunteer.
This is terrific, fabulous. Thank you to everybody. I'm very curious, interested in learning about the cultures of the PAC study, as well as any other cultures around the world, with regard to what government does, what government policies there are to support good parenting or not. And I could go first by making an observation, that just an ad hoc observation about the United States, and would say that the government does almost nothing to support good parenting. You don't need to be credentialed. It takes more to get a license to drive an automobile than to become a parent. It's not really systematically addressed or taught in schools, primary school or secondary schools. You're pretty much on your own. In fact, it's almost intentionally you're on your own, and there's a general belief that government should stay out of parenting and what happens, on the other side of the front door of one's home. There's maybe one exception, which is at the very extreme of child abuse and neglect, where the United States has a system of reviewing, reporting cases of abuse and neglect and investigating those and potentially involuntarily taking a child away from a family if there is harm going on. But outside of that negative end there, I'm not really able to think of much that the government does to support the task of parenting, and raising a child. So I'm very curious about all of the other cultures in the PAC study, what your observations are. Is it like the United States, or is there something different? And I know that in cultures, not outside of government, cultures support in different ways, and families support in different ways. But I'm curious about at the policy level or at the government level.
I can this time be reactive. Also thinking at the question she did about the parenting program in our countries. So related to the question of Ken's question, in Italy, we don't have universal parenting programs. And I would say that the answer to that question would be mainly if they were in consulting with, for psychological problems. So that is, I think, non-formal parenting problem, but so it could be related to problems, to child problems. And Italy has lost, in the 70s, there was more attention in terms of public policy to suspend the penalties and the different gender roles that another point in Italy that the father involvement is similar, I believe, to the Thai countries. So less they are not involved in parenting, and we have seen this in the data. So there are no actions by the government, no public policy, and now the university is asking to be involved. Our action as a university to impact the public policy. And yesterday I told you that I was going to come here in order to learn how we can impact public policy. So there are many, there are no actions that are directly with universal to protect we have a very low, with the exception of Laura, that she has 3 children. She is the only, she's above the other.
Increasing the birth rate of the country.
In our country, we have in Italy, we have 1.2 average number of child in the family. So this means that young people or are not willing to have children because of these difficulties combining work and family life. And also having no deep involvement with fathers.
Other cultures?
On that, Joy?
Well, I can say something about Thailand. I think we take after you. More reactive rather than proactive. Looking like when children are abused, somebody will be there, take some action. Punish the parents and whatever, and then, but until the next one comes up. Very typical.
Yeah, I can say something. In Jordan, it is, they are trying now to do something like related to the parents, but it's like, maybe make it more on like parental leave, helping those working mothers and fathers to get more like time to spend with their children. So maybe this is most of it. The other, efforts done by the NGOs, mostly not like by the government, because they are so busy with so many other things. And maybe they mainly concentrate on education, health, more than on the skill and knowledge and sort of balance. Now, like in UAE, like for example, Abu Dhabi, they are doing tremendous, job and work and looking after the families, all the families are there. So they are really ahead of, I can say, of all maybe Arab countries now is in this regard. So I can see the difference. And of course, the context is different. Like looking at Jordan, there are so many things we need to worry about. Looking at how many refugees we have, how many things we like inside, and we are not wealthy country. Comparing to other countries like the Gulf region, they are UAE, very wealthy country. They have the resources and they can well use these resources, and they have the vision of moving on. So it's interesting how the difference in
What is the family leave policy? So in the United States, in theory, there's protected leave from employment to have a baby, but it's not financially supported. And it's not widely utilized. It's, in fact, my understanding is comparatively poor as compared to a number of other nations. So I'm curious about Italy and Thailand and Jordan with regard to these government supported family leave policy.
This time, Italy has
Italy has that.
Yeah, family, we
What
have
is
6 months, right, Laura? 6 months family days, and
5 months of family.
then you can go in partial day. Scanning the salary, yeah, but you still get pay. So you can cover 1 year.
If you have a home.
Of course.
Because there is not,
Right.
But we have a good protection, it's about 75. Well, with
Sweden is 420 days, but 90 of those days have to be taken by the other parents. So one parent can't use all 420, and they can start and stop at will.
Guaranteed paid
Yes.
by the employer,
Yeah.
paid by the
Well,
employer.
no.
Yeah.
No,
But it's guaranteed.
Yeah, so what it's practice is that many, because of the demands of their job, at least my limited experience there was, would go back kind of when Americans would go back, sometimes 6-10 weeks, work for a little bit to get things going again, for someone to take over and then come back and be home again.
Yeah.
So they often could stretch that out to be home a lot, but not exclusively for about 2 years.
Jordan is 90 days for public sector and 70 days for the private sector, fully paid. But it has to be like around 2 weeks before it give birth. And of course, they can start it from the minute the baby is born, but not like beyond that. That you will use it. This is how they and they will give 3 days for the mother. Only.
Joey, you're gonna say something about that?
yeah, I would like to share about a parenting program in Thailand. I mean about the government support. I just know Department of Mental Health, they try to develop a parenting program. 7 days parenting, with the name, and they just the beginning, they apply with some secondary sector, I mean the hospital. And just I think it's this good beginning. And some of rural areas like border of Thailand. Yeah. And this program I think is we have to make a key factor for people. I mean, very simply to give them like eat. I mean about the how can I say?
They try to make like a key concept.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that means how to make a proper eating, how to make a play, how to have, and how to just tell the story. I mean, before bedtime, something like that. Very simply. And but it's not only it's only applied for some areas now, and they want to develop more.
And I want to add about the 90 days of for mother. In Thailand, we have for father for 3 days.
Yeah.
We have
No.
we have 15 days.
Wow.
15 days, right?
Yeah.
Now what?
Yeah. For all the government officers.
Yeah, you are working for the government only.
But there is not only a small population from Thailand.
And the parenting program that's Joy mentioned is not evidence-based.
Yeah.
And then it goes like they just, thinking, up something.
Yeah.
Even use the triple P word, but it means different. It's not the same triple P model. They just made it up.
Let's eat it right.
Yeah.
I think so. That's a really important point. Like when Susan and I first met each other, I don't know, decades ago now at this point, I think. It was because both of us were working on a project with UNICEF, where UNICEF was trying to have countries evaluate parenting programs in a rigorous way. Because what the deal was at the time was that many countries would bring a parenting program to scale. So sometimes it was being administered at a national level, but with no evidence base at all. And so it was, or the evidence, they would say, oh, it's been evaluated, but the evidence was that after the program was over, they would say, did you like the program? Would you recommend it to the parents would say, yes, I loved it, I would recommend it, and then that was the evidence. Without any sort of pre-post comparison, without any randomization. And oftentimes the argument was, oh, but if we take the money and time to do this evaluation, we'll have less money to spend on providing the services. And then it was kind of walking back a step and saying, well, yeah, but if there's no evidence that it's working, then you could be wasting all of this money at a national level. So we need to know so that it can be changed in a way that actually would have its intended effects. So anyway, that's how Suma and I originally met, was trying to work on these national evaluations.
Well, that's how the government works. If you want to apply to get budget to buy weapons, very quick, very simple.
Thailand.
Susanna, my dissertation work in Tanzania, I did a lot of like interviews with people in the public sector there in terms of child protection and even things that, and there's been not a lot of resources in terms of even just reacting to abuse and things like that. But there's other unintended consequences of other government programs. There was a government program that was defunct, but actually still implemented in the communities and urban areas that like security personnel, like informal police, but it was supposed to protect the people in the urban communities. But parents were paying these informal police to like beat and scare their children in order to like scare them straight if they were misbehaving. So they're kind of outsourcing discipline because they were scared of disciplining their adolescents. They thought they were too old to discipline an adult. So even like other policies can interact with the parenting norms in interesting ways that they definitely weren't interested.
A really interesting example.
Yeah, so then the parent would be like, no, I don't hurt my child, but little do you know that they're outsourcing it. Yeah, that's really interesting.
Any final questions or comments? Go ahead, Anna.
I just wanted to add the conversation because I like what someone said about how the government, what kind of goals government has in putting in policies that could have benefits for parents and children. So this is not a bad country. I'm in Poland where I did study social policy. And currently Poland has an incredible support for families and parents. A year-long maternity fully paid for full-time employees and entrepreneurs, self-employed. 2 weeks for fathers. Universal basic income supplement starting at one on first child. Preschool, high quality, highly regulated from 3 years old. But all of these policies have not been sort of implemented with and are not researched looking at child well-being and parenting and how it impacts families. They were implemented to adjust for low fertility. Poland had a similar issue as Italy with very low fertility. So this was sort of paying individuals to have more children. Political power. Because the party that implemented all those programs has been consistently in power for the past decade. And everyone loves these policies, but there is no evidence rigor of these. So I think a lot of countries kind of struggle with that there's the action of politicians first, and then the research has to come second and try to figure out how to do evaluation of those.
That's a good point. And you're right. I mean, and that's actually sort of a perfect summary of kind of this integration of research and policy and parenting and child development. I think we have 1 minute, so.
My question I think was answered. I wanted to know if there was an example of a nation where we see this integration of sort of the meeting parent needs and social determinants of health and rigorous parenting program being provided, but that might be the answer to that question. Yeah.
Thank you all very much for coming today. We are happy to follow up, sort of informally by email or chat a few minutes now if anyone wants to say, but thank you very much for coming to Wishes with your own work. And thank you sincerely to our presenters,